The vet's truck was still idling in the driveway when the first neighbor pulled up to see for herself. Inside a mason jar on the kitchen table sat 2 ounces of pale, thin milk. And a 9-week-old baby who had not kept down a bottle in 6 days was sleeping, finally, without crying. Nobody in Wexford County had planned for this moment. Nobody had believed it would ever come. But by the time the frost hit the lower pasture that November, half the county would be repeating the same story at the feed store counter, each version a little more astonished than the last. Sadie Callahan wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. She wasn't trying to prove anyone right either. She had her own reasons, and for now, they were hers alone. She was 13 years old, and she lived on 60 acres outside Millhaven, Wexford County, Kentucky, on the same ground her grandmother Eleanor had walked for 40 years before her. If stories about second chances and the animals nobody wanted move you, subscribe and join us every day. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. The Callahan farm sat where the county road bent hard around a stand of white oaks, half a mile from where Coldwater Creek cut through the lower field on its way toward the Kentucky River. Walter Callahan, 68, had run cattle and a few acres of tobacco on that land his whole life. And since Eleanor passed, he'd run it slower, with Sadie beside him more often than not. A leather-bound ledger of her grandmother's sitting on the kitchen shelf, like something nobody quite had the heart to move. The farmhouse itself was white-clapboard with a porch that sagged a little on the north end. A barn behind it gone silver-gray with age. And beyond that the pastures rolled out toward the tree line in long, uneven waves of green and brown, depending on the season. Eleanor had kept that ledger for 4 decades. Weather notes, calving dates, seed prices, the ordinary bookkeeping of a working farm. And after she died, it had become something closer to scripture in that house, opened rarely, but never far from reach. By October, the mornings had turned sharp enough to fog the truck windows, and the lower field along the creek stayed muddy from 3 straight weeks of rain. It was the kind of season that made a hard year harder. And the Callahans, like most of their neighbors, were watching feed prices climb and calf prices sag. The ordinary arithmetic of a small Kentucky farm that never quite balanced the way anyone wanted it to. It was late September when Sadie found the donkey. She'd walked the creek line looking for a lost barn cat and instead found something standing knee-deep in the mud where the bank had washed out. Ribs showing through a coat matted with burrs, one ear torn, too weak to climb the bank on its own. It didn't run from her. It didn't have the strength to. She waded in without thinking twice, looped a length of baling twine around its neck, and half-dragged, half-coaxed it up the slope, while it stumbled and caught itself and stumbled again. By the time she reached the barn, her boots were soaked through and her arms were shaking. And Walter was standing in the doorway with his hands on his hips, not saying a word yet, just looking at the animal like he already knew what kind of winter this was going to be. "That's not a farm animal, Sadie. That's a hole you're fixing to pour money into," he said. But he got the heat lamp anyway. And he got the vet out the next morning. And he didn't say another word about it for 3 days. The vet gave the animal a 50-50 chance at best. It had a low-grade infection in its torn ear, worms bad enough to show in a fecal sample, and hooves so overgrown and cracked they'd clearly gone untrimmed for a year or more. There was no microchip, no brand, no answer when Sadie posted a photo at the feed store in the vet's office asking if anyone had lost a donkey. Whoever it belonged to, if anyone still did, had let it go a long time before it ever reached Coldwater Creek. Sadie named her Junebug. For no reason she could explain, except that it felt wrong to keep calling something it once you'd spent that many nights sitting with her in the straw. Dale Hargrove heard about it before the vet's truck had even left the property. Word traveled fast on a road with 4 houses on it. He drove past slow the following weekend, window down, and called out that the Callahans had finally found an animal even less useful than a barn cat. His brother Roy, riding shotgun, laughed loud enough that Sadie heard it from the porch. She didn't answer them. She went back to filling the water trough. For 2 weeks, the donkey did nothing but stand in the corner of the stall, ears low, barely touching its feed. The vet, a young woman out of Lexington filling in for the retired large animal doctor, said its age was hard to pin down. Somewhere past 15, maybe older, malnourished long before it ever reached the creek. She didn't hold out much hope for it becoming anything more than a pasture ornament, if it lived through the winter at all. Sadie kept at it anyway. She mixed a mash of soaked beet pulp and oats, the way Walter remembered his own father doing for a starved mule back in the 70s. And she sat with the animal for an hour every evening after chores, saying nothing in particular, just being a quiet, steady presence in a stall that had known nothing but neglect for longer than anyone could guess. It was Eleanor's ledger that changed things. Sadie had taken to reading a page or two most nights, the way some kids read a favorite novel before bed. And one evening in October, she found an entry from 1988 in Eleanor's small, slanted handwriting. A note about a neighbor's grandbaby who couldn't hold down formula or cow's milk, and how an old woman 2 farms over had once sworn that a spoonful of fresh Jenny milk, warmed and given slow, was gentler on a baby's stomach than anything from a store shelf. Eleanor had written down the woman's name and little else, no measurements, no method, just a memory she'd thought worth keeping. Sadie read it 3 times. Then she read it to Walter at the breakfast table, and he set his coffee down slower than usual, and admitted he'd heard something like it once, years back. From an old-timer at a livestock sale, though he'd never once seen it done. She didn't announce a plan. She didn't ask permission to try one. She just started asking questions. First at the feed store. Then of the young vet on her next visit. Then, when neither had real answers, of the county extension office, where a receptionist told her Hank Whitfield handled livestock questions and gave her his number. Hank Whitfield had been the Wexford County extension agent for 11 years, and in that time, he'd fielded questions about soil pH, corn blight, and fence law, but never once about donkey milk. He was skeptical on the phone, careful in the way people who've seen 100 farm fads come and go tend to be. But he agreed to drive out and take a look, mostly, he'd admit later, out of curiosity. He found a 13-year-old with a spiral notebook full of feeding logs, weight estimates, and dated notes on the donkey's slow recovery. The kind of record-keeping he rarely saw from grown men running 50 head of cattle. The animal, now 3 months into steady feeding, had put on weight, its coat had started to fill back in, and it followed Sadie around the paddock like it had decided, somewhere along the way, that she belonged to it. Hank explained what she was up against before she went any further. Donkeys, unlike dairy cows or goats, don't let down milk easily without their foal present, and this Jenny had no foal and likely never would again at her age. Yields would be small, a few ounces at a time if she'd cooperate at all. And more than that, anything meant for a baby, even as a supplement and not a replacement, needed to be handled with a level of cleanliness and caution that went well past what most backyard operations bothered with. Sadie wrote all of it down. Then she asked what she'd need to do it right. Hank laid it out plainly, the way he would for any producer asking about a new venture, even one this small. She'd need clean hands and clean equipment every single time, no exceptions, no shortcuts on a day she was tired or in a hurry. She'd need to keep the milk cold within minutes of collecting it, never let it sit warm on a counter the way you might with a jar of cow's milk from the co-op. And she'd need to accept, he told her twice, that this was never going to feed a family the way a dairy operation would. At best, it would be ounces, not gallons. And every ounce would take patience most grown men didn't have. Then I've got the right animal for it, Sadie said. Because patience is about all Junebug's got left to give right now. And it's about all I've got too. Over the following weeks, she rebuilt the milking routine from nothing. She warmed towels before every handling session to keep the donkey calm, the way Hank suggested after reading up on it himself. She practiced patience the animal had never been shown before, sitting beside it in the straw some evenings for 20 minutes before it would even let her near its flank. The first real attempt produced barely 2 tablespoons, and half of that spilled when the donkey startled at a slamming truck door on the road. Roy Hargrove found out about the milking somehow. Sadie never learned how, and made sure the whole county heard about it before she'd collected a single full cup. At the feed store, he told anyone listening that the Callahan girl had taken to milking a half-dead jackass for pocket change. And the story got a laugh from most everyone who heard it, including, Sadie was told later, a few people who should have known better. She kept going. She built a simple, sterile collection routine with mason jars boiled on the stove, a clean stainless pail reserved only for that purpose, and a log of every session's yield down to the ounce, the way Hank had shown her. Some evenings, she got nothing at all. Some evenings, she got 4 ounces, maybe 5, and she froze it in small labeled portions in the chest freezer on the back porch, unsure for a long while what exactly she was saving it for. There were setbacks that had nothing to do with the donkey at all. A hard freeze in late October knocked the power out for 6 hours, and Sadie spent the night packing the chest freezer with bags of ice from the gas station 11 miles down the highway, terrified of losing 3 weeks of careful collection over a downed line. Twice, she second-guessed the whole plan and told Walter she thought it was foolish, and both times he told her the same thing back. That foolish and unproven weren't the same word, and she wouldn't know which one this was until she'd actually finished it. By mid-November, her feeding log ran to 9 pages, and Junebug had learned to nose open the tack room door on her own to reach the mash bucket, a habit that made Walter laugh out loud the first time he caught her at it, the first real laugh Sadie had heard out of him in longer than she could remember. The answer came in November, when a young couple 2 farms down, the Prestons, had a baby girl who couldn't tolerate cow's milk formula in any form the pediatrician in town had tried. The baby cried through the night, lost weight instead of gaining it. And the family was 2 weeks from a 2-hour drive to a specialist in Lexington when Walter mentioned, almost in passing at church, what his granddaughter had been doing out in the barn. The Prestons were desperate enough to listen and skeptical enough to check first. Hank made the call to the family's pediatrician himself, laying out exactly how the milk had been collected, stored, and handled. And the pediatrician, cautious but not dismissive, agreed to a small, closely monitored trial. A single teaspoon, warmed, mixed into the baby's usual feed, under her own supervision. The baby kept it down. Then she kept down the next feeding and the one after that. Word moved through Wexford County the way it always did, fast and slightly distorted with each telling, until by the 2nd week, even people who'd laughed loudest at the feed store were asking Sadie, in low, careful voices, whether it was true and whether there was any more to be had. The Prestons' pediatrician, once the trial proved steady after 10 days, wrote up her observations and sent them, unprompted, to a colleague in Lexington who worked with infants with severe milk protein allergies. She was careful to call it what it was, an unusual, closely supervised case, not a proven treatment. But she noted that the baby had gained 6 ounces in 2 weeks after months of losing weight. And that alone was enough to make people in town stop laughing and start asking real questions. Dale Hargrove drove out to the Callahan place himself in early December, not for milk, but because his own granddaughter, visiting for the holidays, had the same trouble the Preston baby had. He stood in the same barn doorway, where he'd once laughed loudest, hat in his hands, and asked Sadie, plain and quiet, if she could help. She didn't say a word about the truck window or the feed store or any of it. She just walked him through the routine the way she'd walk anyone through it now, showed him the log, the sterile jars, the careful measured ounces, and told him what Hank had told her about handling it safe. Dale left with 2 small containers and an apology he didn't quite know how to phrase, so he didn't try. By the following spring, Sadie had 4 families relying, in small, careful amounts, on what the donkey she'd pulled out of the mud at Coldwater Creek could produce. It was never going to be a business in the way anyone in town understood the word. Never more than a few ounces here and there. Always given under a doctor's watch, never sold, only shared, the way Eleanor's ledger note had first described it. An old kindness passed down a chain of neighbors who needed it. Walter framed the ledger page, the one with Eleanor's note about the Jenny milk, and hung it in the barn above the stall where the donkey, now fattened and glossy-coated, spent her days. Wendell Berry once wrote that there are no unsacred places, only sacred places and desecrated places. And Walter said, standing in that barn one evening with Sadie beside him, that he reckoned an animal was much the same. Nothing on this earth was ever truly worthless, only waiting on somebody patient enough to see what it still had left to give. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to hear what you'd have done in Sadie's place. Drop a comment and let us know. And if you want to go deeper into stories like this one, we've got an ebook waiting for you in the description below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you tomorrow with another story from Wexford County.